Yeah. So I think after Louis, then we will have Tessa from Philippines. Hello, Tessa. Are you here?
Hello, Darkwan.
Hi.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Please go ahead, Tessa.
Okay. So I'm very happy to be sharing this space with you, and I look forward to a vibrant conversation not only with colleagues on the panel, but also with our audiences. I would like to thank VT Art Salon for the invitation to take part in this relevant exchange, the topic of which is foremost in our minds, but to which we don't exactly have a definitive answer. Yet, isn't indeterminacy and unpredictability the very nature of the future? We were asked to consider a few questions for this discussion panel: the effects of the pandemic on the Philippine art world and culture sector, the ways institutions and artists responded to the restrictions arising from the pandemic, and whether a return to a so-called normal life is at all possible. In this presentation, I will share an overview of the situation in the Philippines with specific focus on the arts and culture sector in Metro Manila, where I reside. I will reflect on the shared predicaments of art practitioners and culture advocates by reflecting on 3 projects I did during the pandemic lockdown in the Philippines. Let me share my screen with you. This would lead toward reflections on the future and ideas of futurity that are grounded in the work I am currently doing for the forthcoming 2021 Asian Art Biennial at the National Taiwan Museum of Fine Arts in Taichung. I will be curating the archive component of the biennial, and at some point I began thinking of ways the archive can be reconstructed to be made ever more relevant to our present. How can the archive be regarded as a path towards the future? A section of my presentation will then mention ideas about the future by asking about sensibilities to do with futurity that we can presently generate and engage. I thought this would thwart the often said phrase new normal, of which I am quite skeptical. This riddled many pandemic campaigns, especially those deployed by the state. Well before the pandemic, we perhaps apprehended the future in a far-off sense with a certain degree of optimism. But more recently, the future is a hovering shadow, endowed with an immediacy that we can feel in a very corporeal sense. My reflections will be followed by illustrations from the Philippines of initiatives that best encapsulate attitudes of speculation and innovation. There are several such examples, but I will focus on 3. These are the draft of a manual for collective work by the concerned artists of the Philippines for the overarching project Training for the Future, a utopian training camp whose team is led by the artist Jason Stahl, the Gobierno project spearheaded by the Sipatlawin and Sam, and the numerous projects conceived and realized by the feminist collective Gantala Press. As a coda to the future, I will close the presentation by inviting everyone to take part in Mark Salvatos's call for a do-it-at-home project for our collaboration on the traveling exhibition Notes for Tomorrow. The exercise can perhaps summon our desires of what the future can be, even while the world continues to be nebulous and is probably falling apart. While artists and cultural workers seem to have been at the front line of pandemic relief efforts in the Philippines, little support has been given them, as was the case for the rest of the Southeast Asia region and other parts of the world. Our support and relief networks were mostly self-organized. It wasn't only the fear of contracting the COVID-19 virus we contended with, but many of us also faced the loss of income, the postponement, and even the cancellation of projects, events, and exhibitions. Most worrisome of this is the continued persecution and repression that artists and cultural workers suffer from the state. The pandemic lockdown in the Philippines was one of the longest implemented in the world. In the early months of the lockdown, surveys were conducted among artists and practitioners, including the rapid assessment disseminated by the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, which was meant to aid the development of the Cultural Response and Resiliency Plan, the survey by the Nayong Filipino Foundation and Creative Aid PH, which was regarded as a research tool and as part of the foundation's multi-sectoral consultations, and the report with quantifiable data generated by a lostmygig.ph. Between March and May 2020, the first 3 months of the lockdown, I lost my gig.ph reported 5,314 lost projects, 4,167 people affected, and a net loss income of 251,315,175 Philippine peso. Around this time last year, I helped organize and facilitate a virtual workshop alongside Load Na Dito with support from the Japan Foundation Manila, the Art Studies Foundation, and the Philippine Contemporary Art Network. Majority of our participants had ongoing and or planned projects that were either postponed or canceled. So this is the fourth iteration of the workshop series that we conceived and facilitated from 2019. We had several sessions conducted in Manila, Luzon, and Mindanao. Sometime in 2020, I also received an invitation to be part of the traveling exhibition Notes for Tomorrow, organized by the Independent Curators International in New York. Artist Mark Salvatos and I collaborated on an iteration of his Mount Manahaw project, which by far have traveled to 2 sites in the United States. What you're seeing is installation view of his piece at Haverford College in Haverford, Philadelphia, and the more recent exhibition opened in Calgary in Canada. The project is called Ang Araw na Nakapita-pita, or That Day Most Eagerly Awaited, a line from the Passion, a prayer and a hymn recited and sung by Catholics during Lent in the Philippines. In the latter part of the year, the Philippine Contemporary Art Network, in coordination with the University of the Philippines Vargas Museum and the Japan Foundation Manila, hosted its curatorial development workshop. We launched the physical component of the exhibition proposals by selected participants alongside exhibitions curated by the director and coordinators of the Philippine Contemporary Art Network. I curated the exhibition We Are Going to Have to Live Outside for the Proto-Para Rethinking Curatorial Work at the UP Vargas Museum. So we're looking at Mark Salvatos' installation at the lawn of the museum called Whistles. And these are other installation views of works by artists Alvin Safra and Manuel Santos, Isho Malon, and Gwen Kalubayan at the ground floor space of the museum. All 3 projects required a rethinking of how things were done. Virtual meetings, to which I'm not exactly used to, streamlining tasks, especially those to do with logistics, and a rethinking of the requisite components of exhibitions. These echo the so-called changes and acceleration of processes that shape the Philippine art world. There were numerous online exhibitions and virtual viewing of works, with museums and institutions operating at limited capacity. It was remarkable, however, that commercial galleries continued mounting selling exhibitions, with several new spaces opening despite a slowdown caused by the pandemic. Local residencies and mentoring programs initiated by artist groups and artists themselves were launched with exhibitions as projected outcomes. Art Fair Philippines and Art in the Park migrated to online platforms, introduced and sponsored artist residencies, as well as NFTs. On the other hand, the vital strength of self-organized efforts by artists and artist groups and organizations propelled the calls and consolidation of resources to aid each other in disadvantaged communities. I am sharing a campaign by Pag-asa, from which our women partners from my Escolta research project benefited. The Escolta research project is a project that explores the development of neighborhoods in Southeast Asia, and I have worked for the past 5 years with colleagues from the region as well as with artists Alma Quinto and Natalie Dagmang. Social media platforms aided the formation of these new forms of solidarities. While these efforts have long been cultivated by arts and cultural organizations in the Philippines, those previously mentioned emergent practices, while trickling in place before the pandemic, prompts us to ask whether they are new at all or whether they have only been pushed forward by pandemic circumstances. A typical approach to the future would only reduce it to, I quote from the work of Savransky, matters of anticipation, calculation, management, and preemption of risks, end of quote. In this case, the future and its possibilities are reduced to the logics and problematics of the present. What attitudes and sensibilities instead towards futurity can we cultivate? How can we think about, or more specifically, think along about the future? These sensibilities of the future can be thus productive in shoring up, and I quote again from that work by Savransky, new habits and practices of attention, invention, and experimentation, which corresponds to a temporality that can be referred to as eventful. Hence, in the title of the presentation, I describe the future as an event. Eventful time or an eventful temporality is marked by the unexpected eruptions of the impossible, of social, political, economic, philosophical, and ecological events that cannot be anticipated, opening up possible futures that cannot be managed in advance. Siegel's work from 2005 elaborates on this eventful temporality as assuming that, and I quote, contingent, unexpected, and inherently unpredictable events that can undo or alter the most apparently durable thread of history, end of quote. Philosopher Rosalind Diprose outlined the conventional meanings of speculation as being associated with introspective reflection, prediction or forecasting, and investing for financial gain coupled with the risk of loss. Yet, there remains value in reclaiming speculative practices of thought, action, and care. Speculation, by its very nature, as a process of thought, is futural, or that which is open to worlds of possibility, potentiality, and the unknown. The futural is without a predictable outcome. I will now cite initiatives involving artist groups and organizations in the Philippines that engage this manner of futurity through processes that outline and articulate a collective agency, which Diprose defines as, and I quote from her, the phenomenon of changing things, having an impact, beginning something new. In short, innovation, end of quote. These projects embarked on the quest for the possible or even the impossible, and by doing so, they construct and enact possible schemas by which the indeterminacy of the future can be fleshed out. In March this year, the concerned artists of the Philippines, together with Ugat Lahi Artist Collective, organized Training for the Future, Draft for a Manual on Collective Work. The workshops were meant to reflect on the redistributive and regenerative principles of collective work in cultural production for mass movements in the Philippines, sharing experiences in effigy production and a study of texts such as Araling Aktivista or activist studies were done during the workshop's first session. These activities were geared towards the draft for the manual. And they were part of the Training for the Future, a utopian training camp where audiences become trainees who pre-enact alternative scenarios to reclaim means of producing the future. The workshop in Manila happened alongside parallel events across cities in Argentina, Colombia, Italy, South Africa, Switzerland, and the US. So this video is an introduction to the project Training for the Future, but I will skip to the part where the workshop in Manila is featured. All right.
Making kasaysayan at pagko-contextualize ng FEG production sa Pilipinas. Na may particular na focus doon sa politiko.
Pinakita ko lang graphically. Iba siya. So, magkikita-kita sila. Pero, eventually, yung siya nakakaluan na siya naman.
So that is a snippet of the workshops conducted by the concerned artists of the Philippines. I'll go back to my presentation. So the Gobierno project, on the other hand, is an interactive performance and participatory filmmaking workshop where audience create their ideal governments, redesign cities and communities, and propose governmental policies and laws. It was initiated by the Sipat Lawin and Sam, a contemporary performance company with collaborators from the Philippines, Australia, and the US. It was first prototyped in 2015 and has taken on various formats, including short workshops that run from between 2 to 4 hours and durational performances. So let's view a snippet from the Gobierno, rather a snippet on the Gobierno project.
The Gobierno Project is an interactive theatrical performance that gives audiences the opportunity to create their ideal government, reimagine and design cities, propose new governmental policies and laws, to be shared and recorded in their own documentaries. Through this project, we wanted to bring people together in a safe space where people can share their concerns and raise important issues regarding their country, as well as share their hopes for the future. Imagine possibilities and accomplish more as a collective rather than individually.
Alright, so that's a snippet of the Gobierno project. Gantala Press, on the other hand, is an independent, not-for-profit, volunteer feminist press established in Manila in 2015. Her works center on women's stories and issues realized in projects that include publications, small press fairs, discussions, and workshops. They donate part of their earnings to projects that support the dispossessed and other victims of state violence. Gantala Press is national coordinator of the Southeast Asia Feminist Action Movement, or SEAFAM, a network of grassroots feminist groups in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. They are also part of the Free Amanda Echani's network and Amiha's #Defend Peasant Women campaign, which are both ongoing. Two of their more recent publications are Kumusta Kayo? Naratibo ng Kababaihang Magbubukid Ngayong Pandemya, or roughly translated, How Are You? Narratives of Women Peasants during the pandemic, and Lutong Gipit, Mga Recipes sa Panahon ng Krisis, or this is a cookbook for times of crisis, co-published with Amiha National Federation of Peasant Women and Rural Women Advocates. Tay Cura, one of the founders of Gantala Press, also did a series of cloth books, some of which appear in the virtual exhibition on the pandemic and state repression When the Storm Comes, organized with support from the Japan Foundation and in partnership with another small press in Vietnam. What you see to your right is a coloring book, a zine to be published by Gantala Press, titled Women, Masks, and Protest. So I encourage everyone to visit the Gantala Press site, buy the books and the zines, and contribute to the cause of their women partners. These initiatives and projects illustrate how the future can best be reckoned with, through collective thought and action, and acted by thinking with and through others, an articulation of a political agency whose disclosure is embarked on collectively and performatively, according to Diplos. This is a manner of thought and a practice of thinking that encounters the corporeality and immediacy of actual encounters, practices that are enfolded in the flesh of the world. As mentioned earlier, I invite you to take part in artist Mark Salvatos's art project. Through the project Ang Araw na Nakapita-Pita that they most eagerly awaited, he proposes the home as a thriving ecology, and the notion that the acts of waiting itself and the mode of slowness are themselves imbued the political. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks, Tessa, to bring us these wonderful presentations, and we can see lots of Filipino artists and the art collective, how they are respond from the economy or the virtual exhibition, or even for the workshop performance, and from the agricultures. I think which is also really important for all of us to rethinking what art can bring for our societies. Yeah. So.